with his motorcycle. Now, I know not all of you know much about StarCraft, but if you need catching up on the history, please don't hesitate to contact your local South Korean consulate, where they would be happy to answer all of your questions. That said, very basically, the Protoss, aka the Firstborn, are a technologically advanced, sapient humanoid race with psionic powers who are one of the 3 dominant species in the StarCraft universe, along with the Terrans and the ruthless Zerg. They're still aliens though, and so we hate them. But today, we are going to learn from them. The first flaw to discuss is carriers. Carriers are heavy warships that serve as command centers for fleet commanders. Now, those of you in the know will say that carriers are very powerful ships, and that isn't untrue. They are heavily armed and protected by plasma shields. They also have the versatility of being able to operate in atmospheric conditions or deep space. Though losing importance due to the rise of the Void Ray, carriers play a central role in Protoss Fleet maneuvers. The issue with carriers is offensive capability. The ships have purifier beams that are used for glassing or planet cracking. However, carriers have no other armament aside from interceptors. There seems to be no reason for the lack of lighter offensive weaponry that can be used for smaller scale combat in space. Carriers are also slow and bulky, and these weaknesses have been exploited by the Zerg. Many have speculated that the reason the carrier is still even in use at all is due to the Protoss' reverence for the ship, meaning that their non-progressive society is partly to blame for this flaw. The next flaw is that the Protoss are not very unified. As collectivist as the Protoss might be, throughout their history they have had trouble keeping all of the members of their race united under a single set of beliefs and fighting together as one. Millions of years ago, a group of Protoss were led away from the rest of their Protoss kindred by an evil xel'naga named Amon. These Protoss are called the tal'darim, or the Forged, and have evolved to be a fanatical, warlike sect of Protoss. There were also rogue Protoss in StarCraft prehistory who refused to submit to the Kala, the main religion of the Kalai, the most common of the Protoss kindreds. These rogues were exiled by the Kalai and became known as the Nerazim, or the Dark Templar, a group that cuts off their psionic appendages as a rejection of the collective and their literal connection to it, and has evolved over time to be much more individualistic than the Kalai. Yeah, self-amputation. You just got owned, Kalai. All of these different groups have different strengths, abilities, beliefs, and behaviors. This in itself isn't a flaw, but that the Kalai don't necessarily foster loyalty and fealty in every Protoss is possibly a reflection of a flawed system of citizen cultivation. The Protoss are not able to harness the full alien power of their race. The next flaw is the Psionic Matrix. A Psionic Matrix refers to the circular matrix used to provide power to Protoss buildings, allowing them to produce units and research upgrades. Many might consider the Psionic Matrix to be an advantage because it allows for the instant deployment of troops and buildings to the battlefield. But the problem is that the Protoss heavily depend on these matrices for power. If a Protoss structure loses connection with a matrix, it will shut down until it's reconnected, meaning that through the matrix the Protoss are vulnerable. When the term Psionic Matrix is used, what comes to mind is the major one that was on the Protoss homeworld of Ire. This matrix, a network of crystals embedded in the crust of the planet that generated and spread psionic energy throughout the Koprulu sector of space, had to be destroyed to prevent the malevolent xel'naga Amon from warping in the Golden Armada. The dismantling of the Psi Matrix put the Protoss force in jeopardy. Furthermore, the Protoss would need to build a matrix anywhere in space they went in order to maintain power for their fleet and ground forces, and thus the Protoss are most effective in their home sector where they don't have to prepare these structures. The matrices are basically interplanetary colostomy bags, without which the Protoss can't do shit. And even with an abundance of matrices, they still make prime targets for enemies. I suppose they had no other choice though. Well, aside from solar power. The next flaw to discuss is that the Protoss are a declining population. Sure, the Protoss can live for up to 1,000 years, but they have a low population regardless thanks to constant conflict. They're somewhat of an impotent race as well that don't seem to reproduce much. I could give the Protoss a harder time for this, but to be fair, their females seem to lack holes. Their lack of numbers forces them to use robots in their military and for production of resources, of which they do not have an abundance of. In itself, a result of limited population. Of course, a lack of alien power also means a lack of numbers on the battlefield as well. One might expect with more Protoss to fight in battle, with more weapons and resources, and with a unified race, the Protoss would dominate against the Zerg and Terrans. The next flaw is a lack of skilled crew members. From the shuttle to the Phoenix, the Protoss have a great number of capable ships. The Great Fleet is replete with advanced warships and aircraft of all sorts. They are technologically advanced enough to dominate space and atmospheric warfare. However, because the Protoss population is in decline, there is a lack of ready and able Protoss to alien these ships. Most notably, skilled pilots are in short supply, meaning that despite advanced technology, the ships have to be supplemented with robot droid power. This makes Protoss pilots integral parts of a ship's crew, and if something happens to them, an entire mission or even the ship itself could be in jeopardy. The next flaw is collectivism and conformity. The Khalai, the central Protoss faction, does not place heavy emphasis on the individual. For much of their history, Protoss society was organized into a caste system before being abolished by Protoss leader Artanis. This has helped to reinforce a class-based mentality in its subjects that robs them of their individuality and promotes the state first. This is what led to the Dark Templar in the first place. Thus, many Khalai don't aspire to rise above their brothers and prosper, and thus Protoss society is most likely not commoditizing the talents of its inhabitants or incentivizing its population to think creatively and be innovative. The Khalai have achieved advanced technology nonetheless, but one can only assume their accomplishments would be far greater if they reinforced conformity less and allowed more talented and creative individuals to rise. This brings us to our next flaw, which is that the Protoss are slow to accept change. Any religious society is going to be more conservative than others, and this is no different for the Protoss. The Kala is a rigid doctrine of belief, and the Khalai fear deviating from their religious tenets. This is seen clearly in their rejection of the Nazarim, who could have been valuable members of society, but instead were exiled because of their lack of faith. The Protoss are liable to put the Kala before their best interests, a vulnerability that their enemies can exploit. The Protoss follow the religious principles of Dai-Ul, great stewardship, and Kala, a path of ascension. These principles make the Protoss an honorable race, but also make them act against their own best interest at times, such as in protecting weaker races in the galaxy, rather than using their time and resources to mobilize themselves into a supreme fighting force. This leads us to our next flaw, which is a lack of female Protoss in important positions. Among the Khalai, female Protoss are rarely seen in positions of power and don't play a significant role in Protoss society. Many Protoss even look down on Terran women, but to be fair, the only one they've ever really had contact with ended up turning into the devil and trying to kill them all. Contrast that with my ex, and me and the Protoss have plenty in common. But I digress. I'm not saying that as a general rule, if females are not in combat positions, the society in question is flawed. What I am saying, however, is that the breakaway Protoss, the Nerazim, do have a prominent position for females called matriarch, and the females in this role have proven to be highly valuable assets. Razagal was the matriarch of the Nerazim, and she proved to be one of the most powerful psychics in the galaxy and was known for her stoicism and calmness in times of great chaos. And the current matriarch, Vorazun, is a skilled warrior able to teleport around the battlefield, killing multiple enemies at once. The Khalai and their rape culture are, as usual, limiting their own potential by holding women down in society. The next flaw up is robots. The Protoss are not a prolific race and thus need assistance to produce things and fight on the battlefield. Thus, Protoss military capability often relies on automated robotic war machines. With such ubiquitous use of robots, they entrust huge responsibility to non-Protoss entities not necessarily loyal to their cause that pose the threat of uprising. The Purifiers are a robotic race created by the Protoss to replicate the greatest warriors in Protoss history. Given that the aim with the Purifiers was to create a fighting force elite even for Protoss standards, their creation was a serious risk. Indeed, during the Protoss Empire, the Purifiers rebelled and had to be put down by the Protoss. Then there is the Colossi, massive robotic walkers designed by the Protoss to destroy large numbers of ground targets. Colossi are a bit antiquated at this point in StarCraft history, which is probably for the best because some Protoss believe they cannot be controlled and could also end up rebelling against them. If the Zerg don't get the Protoss, their own robots might, a lesson we can all learn from, especially those of us who own Roombas. The last advantage is simple, a lack of diversity of enemies. Sure, the Protoss have existed for millions of years, but over that time their main threat has been the Zerg, a race that while having variation among its breeds, is still somewhat homogeneous as an enemy. Now that we've covered Warhammer on this channel, it's only fair to judge other factions relative to the factions in the 40k universe, where the enemies are incredibly powerful and of various different forms, species, and dimensions. The Protoss know how to fight the Zerg, but if confronted with other threats, it's unknown how they'd fare. Okay, it's time to vote for the Protoss. Please click in the top right corner of the video and rate them on a scale of 1 to 5. Remember, you will get another chance to do so after the advantages video. Stay tuned for all our videos coming up in this series, and hit that subscribe button, please. For now, I'm American Ben, reminding you to never forget the men and women who have perished fighting aliens throughout the universe. Heroes who died protecting freedom. We fight on for them, my brethren, and for Argentina. Humanity first and die Navi scum. Generation Films, dismissed.